Yeah, so over the last few evenings, my Tribando and I have been exploring themes from the Buddhist life. And tonight, in a way, we're coming to the real climax of the story. So 2 nights ago, I told the story of the Buddha's birth and how he became disillusioned with worldly life, how he left home on a quest in search of freedom from suffering. And last night, Maitreya Bandhu talked about what he then did on the quest, how he tried out different ways of practicing, went to different teachers, and how these different ways of practicing just did not get him anywhere. They did not really get him any closer to what he was seeking. And where we left Siddhartha, the Buddha, to be last night was on the banks of the Naranjara River, near the town of Gaya, having left his friends who abandoned him when he started eating a little bit of food. And he's now he's going to be sat at the foot of what we now call the Bodhi tree. But before I go on to the next bit of the story, I just want to pause a little and reflect a bit on how it is that we've been listening to teachings, how it is that we've been listening to these stories, how it is that we've sort of been like evoking something of the myth and the parable of the Buddhist life, how we've been going into a more imaginative, in a way, sort of more magical realm with the practice of puja. And Maitreya Bandhu and I have been talking a little bit about myth and parable at the start of the stories, and talking a little bit about the difference between the truth of fact, the truth of history, and the truth of myth. And there's been a little bit of discussion and questions around this area on Slack, which I found quite interesting. I'm sorry if I haven't sort of like really gotten into the discussion too much, but I've definitely been thinking about these questions. And one of the sort of reflections that I had, it's not so much a reflection, it's more like a memory of one of Sangharakshita's aphorisms, which is literalism is the death of Buddhism. Yeah, so that's what he said. Literalism is the death of Buddhism. With these stories that Maitreya Bandhu and I are telling, in a certain sort of way, we don't mean you to take them literally. We don't take them literally. And if you do, you're probably going to get the wrong end of the stick, and probably it's a little bit dangerous. I thought maybe we could perhaps say that literalism is a little bit like a spectrum. You know, on one hand, you've got credulous literalism, where you believe, I don't know, like everything from like crystals to fairies and things like that to literally be true. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have dismissive cynicism. So dismissive cynicism would be a little bit like, I don't know, poo-pooing everything that you can't prove to be empirically true. Yeah, and there are dangers in both. Yeah, there are dangers in both extreme views. And probably modern society might veer us towards encouraging dismissive cynicism. I definitely know that when I worked in a corporate job, my colleagues used to tease me. They used to say SYT, so that's what they used to call me. SYT, you are so young and so cynical. And they sort of said it in a slightly approving way, as if that was really going to get me somewhere. But actually, cynicism is such an impoverished and poor and flat way of looking at life, yeah? It sort of like gets you depressed if you're not already depressed, yeah? So what I think is really important is that what we need to do is to broaden the way we listen to these teachings, listen to these stories. We need to broaden the way we sort of take meditation instruction, the way we practice meditation. And what I think might be quite a good analogy for this is how we as humans have only a certain range of, light frequency that we can see, or a certain range of sounds that we can hear. And what we, if we, in the sort of like rational mind, is like a certain range of consciousness or thought that we're able to process. And what we might need to do is just to learn to broaden that range. And when we are able to broaden that range, it's not as if we lose the rational mind. It's just that we're not confined to that range of rational reasoning. You're not limited to only that little bit of awareness and consciousness. I hope that's clear. I say all this, and I know that if anything, perhaps I'm on the more rationalistic, scientific, materialist, cynical end of the spectrum. My mother, I told you the other night, she's a chemistry teacher, so I've brought up with doing experiments to prove stuff. I'm a trained civil engineer. I used to work in the city, and I just got that kind of mind, Didn't go to art school. So when I was on my origination retreat, I was 3 months up the Spanish mountain, and one of my best friends, Sakasa Jyoti, we went foraging, we went gleaning. I was cooking for the whole retreat that evening, and I took her into the kind of woody bits of that mountain to forage for herbs, wild thyme, it grew, oregano, things like that. And she got really excited. I mean, I was happy because, I was probably making the walnut bolognese, which I quite like. Having some herbs just meant that the food would be tastier, it would be nicer. But Akasa Jyoti, she got really, really excited because for her, it just meant that we were living and existing in a magical realm that manifested everything that we needed just at the right time. Yeah. And I just realized how different that way of existing, how different that way of moving in the world was. And if I was able to drop that veil of utilitarianism, just sort of seeing things in terms of what use they are to me, and have a broader perspective, my life would be different. My mental state would be different. I could still put herbs into the dinner. I could still put the herbs into the walnut bolognese or whatever it was. But the world that manifests what I need at exactly the right time is a world where gratitude and interconnectedness and love just keeps flowing and flourishing. Yeah? Do you see? It's quite a different way of existing. Okay. Anyway, back to the story of the Buddha. So what happened next? You could say that what happened next was Siddhartha sat down and he meditated all night. And then when he got up, he was the Buddha. And I'm not sure if you've ever watched anyone meditating. It's pretty boring. So I used to come to the London Buddhist Center pretty religiously every Friday evening to do 90 minutes of meditation that was completely unled and a 45-minute ritual. I really did not know much about meditation at that time. I used to sit right over there. That was my favorite spot next to the teacher. And after about 20 minutes, because I didn't know very much about meditation, after about 20 minutes, I just opened my eyes and give up. And I either just look at the Buddha or I watch other people meditating. And nothing happens. Nothing happens. Probably less even happens than when you're watching the washing machine go round and round. There's more movement there, So what it looks like from the outside, can be really, really different from the internal experience. And I hope that all of you are already experiencing that. Now, pretty much all of you are just sort of sitting still for quite a few minutes a day. But a lot can happen on the inside if you're turning up. So actually, what happens under the Bodhi tree is one of my favorite bits of the dramatization and the myth of the Enlightenment story. And there are quite a lot of different tellings of this. Probably my favorite is from the Lalita Vistra, which scholars think were completed around the 3rd century, so quite a few hundred years after the Buddha's lifetime. And in the story, Siddhartha starts to walk towards the Bodhi tree. He's obtained some kusha grass, which is traditionally used in India for all sorts of ritual and ceremonial purposes. So very, very special grass. And as he approaches the tree, devas appear, so these radiant beings of light. And they appear and they make the Bodhi tree the most wonderful meditation space that ever was. They basically remodeled the Bodhi tree, making its roots, its trunk, its branches, its leaves, its fruit, everything perfectly proportioned, beautiful, magnificent. And devas then cause jewels to appear and surround the Bodhi tree, and light rays just emanate from it. One of the questions that appeared on Slack yesterday was about why devas appear in different episodes of the Buddha's life, and particularly around leaving the palace. And one of the responses, I think it was Maitra Bandhu who said, well, devas appear when events of cosmic significance are taking place. And the Lalita Vistra actually goes even further than that. And it goes on to say that as Siddhartha was walking towards the seat of awakening, rays of light streamed forth from his body, and the light pacified all the realms, causing unfortunate states to disappear. All painful feeling and all suffering came to a halt. Anyone who was diseased was healed, anyone feeling discomfort attained happiness, and anyone who was afraid found release. At that moment, all sentient beings were relieved from harm inflicted. Anyone who was afflicted by attachment or anger or ignorance or greed or cruelty or ill will or envy or jealousy, everyone was just temporarily released from those states. Isn't that beautiful? I think the world just stops for a moment and all suffering is eased. Anyway, I'll just leave you to ponder that and ponder the significance of that. So Siddhartha sits under this magnificent, completely remodeled Bodhi tree, and for a moment that just becomes the center of the universe. And the first thing that he does under the Bodhi tree is that he makes a resolve. He makes a resolve and makes a resolution before he even starts his meditation. And his resolution is to strive, not to just vaguely turn up and vaguely meditate, but to be steady and steadfast and really practice for the end of suffering. He says, on this seat, my body may wither and rot, and my skin and bones and my flesh may dissolve. Yet until I attain awakening, so hard to find for many aeons, I will not move my body from the seat. I mean, isn't that great? What would our meditation be if we all just made not even that level of resolution, but some kind of resolution to really meditate? Wouldn't it be great if we really put the whole of ourselves and the whole of our energy behind each sit? Yeah. Now, as Siddhartha is on the cusp of awakening, onto the scene arrives Mara. Actually, when Maitra Bandhu asked me to step into leading this retreat, this was a bit that I got really excited about, telling the story of Mara, because I really, really am interested about Mara. So Mara is quite a curious figure in Buddhism. Mara is sometimes talked about as the Buddhist equivalent of Satan. But it's not really that simple, Mara is both a figure that represents evil, so he's kind of like the epitome of evil, and he's even referred to in the text as Papiyan. Papa in Sanskrit means bad, wrong, evil. Papiyan means evil one, so he's referred to as Papiyan. He's also referred to as Nimuchi, the demon. But Mara can also represent psychological forces within us as individuals, within us as communities, that keep us bound up in suffering, forces that obstruct our practice. It's said that Mara rules over the realms of craving, the realms of delusion, and the realms of death. And traditionally, Mara only gets interested in us when we start to really practice, when we're on the cusp of escaping him, even if it's only temporarily. Mara only really gets interested and starts to interfere when we're on the cusp of a spiritual breakthrough. And I was thinking, what would it be like for us? So I thought, well, since all of us are on retreat, maybe you might find that you're getting a little bit into your meditation. You might even start to be getting a little bit into dhyana. Maybe you've had a taste of something that's much more peaceful, much more blissful, maybe even a taste of something exalted, an exalted mental state. And then the thought arises, ooh, how can I bring this up in the next breakout group? And that's Mara, yeah. That's Mara. Because almost immediately you then just like fall out of your meditation, fall out of your state. Or perhaps, you're about to make quite a big change in your life that will really simplify your life, help you live a more skillful, more positive life. And then your ex-boss or an ex-friend or an ex-partner calls you up, turns back up in your life and offers you a stressful but high-paying job or tries to draw you back in an unhelpful lifestyle. That's what Mara can be like. So Mara appears, and in this story, he is in his own realm. This is another little digression, but Mara's realm actually isn't in the underworld. Think like in the sort of like Western conception of things, heaven is up there and hell is down there. But actually, Mara doesn't sort of live in the underworld. He lives in the Tavatimsa heaven, yeah? So some of you will know it as the Tushita heaven. Mara actually lives in a very, very obscure end of one of the levels of the Tushita heaven, where gods and other devas live. So Mara is in his realm, and he is asleep, just as the Buddha starts to sit down under the Bodhi tree. And he's not having a very good night at all. He's not having a very good sleep. In fact, he's having a very, very bad dream. And in his bad dream, 32 bad omens appear. So I won't really go into it all, but you can think it's pretty awful. He dreams that his realm is filled with darkness and dust. He dreams that his children are crying out for him. He dreams that his army is completely vanquished. And he dreams that he's completely abandoned by his entourage. He's abandoned by his retinue. So Mara wakes up from this really terrible dream and he's like sweating, all humanity. So Mara really gets into action. He quickly calls together his retinue. He quickly calls together his army, his sons and his daughters. And that's a really terrifying sight, I don't know whether you've been like watching Lord of the Rings, like Maichabanda and his community. But if you know the Lord of the Rings at all, you can sort of like imagine the Urkai, like the uber orcs of the Lord of the Rings, but like 1,000,000 times uglier and 1,000,000 times more fearsome. And this massive army of like really ugly Mara beings, they advance onto Gaia and completely without warning, they start to loosen their arrows and throw bolts of lightning and rain down hot sand, raise storm, vomit poisonous snakes and spew flames, shouting, screaming, shaking the land, throwing mountains at the Buddha. And when these weapons, as these projectiles, as these missiles come into contact with the Buddha's aura, so they don't even like hit the Buddha, they're like quite far away because the Buddha's aura extends for quite a bit. As they come into the Buddha's aura, they're transformed into flowers and red lotus petals, and they fall down harmlessly onto the Buddha, and they garland the Bodhi tree. So I just really love, you can probably tell, I really, really love this episode of turning arrows into flowers. And I think it's extremely appropriate because our retreat is about metta. And metta is that force, it's that aura that protects Siddhartha and turns the arrows into flowers. That's what metta does. Metta protects us and protects our mind. And interestingly, metta doesn't cause harm to the aggressor. It's a very, very important point, I think, that metta, that aura of metta that surrounds Siddhartha doesn't like just turn the missiles back upon Mara's army. It sort of falls harmlessly. And in fact, it perfumes and beautifies the Bodhi tree. It beautifies the Buddha's surrounding. So as I've been reflecting on this, I think that for most of us, it's not just that the arrows come our way, sort of like randomly, but actually, often I think for most of us, maybe I'll speak for myself, like for me, I know that I cause things and incidents and people to become the arrows in the first place. Yeah. So through my forgetfulness of interconnectedness, through my fear of getting into more honest communication, I think it's really, really easy for me and probably for others to turn people into arrows. One of the things I've noticed is this year, because it's been quite an anxious year and at times I've been like stressed or tired, I can get into the state when, as I open my email inbox, before I even read some of the emails, I can just sort of like see them coming in. I already have a view that this particular email is going to be critical or difficult, and it's going to be like an arrow. I haven't even opened the email yet at this point, and I start to like work up resistance. Sometimes even like stories about what I think they're going to say and why they're going to be wrong before I even open the email. I was talking a little bit to one of my friends this week about communication, and she was saying that particularly in this time where we're not probably in direct communication, direct physical communication, and we're communicating virtually, it's just so easy to turn people into monsters. So Mara, upon seeing that his army was not just having no effect, but actually garlanding and perfuming the Buddha and his surroundings, Mara got really upset. He got really angry, and he was shaking with jealousy and with rage. So he tried again. But this time, instead of trying to attack the Buddha, he tried to seduce the Buddha. Now, in some stories, Mara has got 3 daughters. He's got Tanha, which is craving. He's got Arati, which is discontent. And he's got Raga, which is passion. But in the accounts that I really like, he just has like a whole legion of daughters. So like, thousands of daughters. And they sashay into the Bodhi tree with their best moves, which according to the Lalita Vistra, there are 32. There are 32 best moves to seduce the Buddha. And I thought I'd just read some of them out to you. So some of the girls partially covered their face. Some of them smiled at him and flashed their teeth. Some lifted their arms and waved them in the air to reveal their armpits. Some looked at the Bodhisattva through half-closed eyes and then quickly closed their eyes. Some showed off their breast, adorned with strings of pearl, and some showed off their half-naked thighs. Some displayed jays and parrots and minor birds sitting on their heads and shoulders. Actually, I bumped into Shradagita on her way out of the yoga class and me coming in to lead this session, and she told me that there was a parrot in one of her yoga classes this week. So I thought that was very cute. Anyway, so some of Mara's daughters had parrots, and some cast sidelong glances at Siddhartha. Some mischievously moved back and forth in a flirtatious manner. Some danced, some sang. Some flirted and acted shy. Some shook their thighs like a palm tree moving in the wind. And some dressed in transparent cloth with bells hanging from the strings at their waist and walked around giggling. Some stripped off all their clothes and jewelry, and some showed off all their jewelry, both secret and apparent. Some covered their face with a veil and then suddenly revealed it. And this is my favorite, actually. Some laughed and played and had fun trying to attract each other's attention. And then again, they pretended to be shy. And then last of all, some tried to lure the Siddhartha with offers of love. So anyway, I find that quite interesting. At least it sort of tells you what they found sexy in medieval India. But Siddhartha, he sat resolute and at ease, neither looking at Mara's daughters or looking away. And then he engaged them in a conversation. He engaged them in a little Dharma debate with the daughters of Mara praising the delights of worldly carnal pleasure, and Siddhartha rejoining on the faults and the pitfalls of craving. And then at the end of this debate, at the end of this conversation, Mara's daughters grew really respectful of the Buddha and their hearts filled with joy. They filled and grew, and they grew with wisdom and understanding, and they left him to his meditation. Mara's daughters go back to Mara and they say that they've tried every female trick on him. And surely with their lust, any man would have just stopped meditating, basically. But Siddhartha was not distracted, not even for a moment. He was immovable and he was immutable. So the Buddha was unmoved in the face of craving. And I think a lot of the time as practitioners, we can often think that the object of our craving, the object of our attachment, of our clinging, are like chocolate biscuits or sex or Netflix. And I don't mean to downplay the negative effects of all these things. But I think it's also really, really important that what we cling to, what we're attached to, what we hold on to tightly is much, much more than that. And perhaps one of the things that we cling to that we might not put enough emphasis on in our day-to-day life is our views, yeah? So views, or disi in Pali, are our underlying assumptions of the way the world works. They color our perception, our thoughts, our emotions, our opinions, the whole experience of life. Yeah. So they're the way that we conceive. So maybe they don't even just color our perception. Our views basically are our perceptions. And we really love our views and we really hold on to them strongly. We love our assumptions and effectively and efficiently. But when we hold on tightly to our assumptions on how the world works and think, yeah, this is how the world works or this is how the world should work, then we start to limit ourselves. In a way, you could say that the whole of Buddhist practice is to go from unwise views, unwise assumptions, to progressively wiser views, to progressively more helpful views, and then finally all the way to no view at all. The Buddha very, very famously said that from the point of his enlightenment onwards, he never said anything. And what he meant there was that he just had no views. He didn't sort of like profess any view. So when you start to, I didn't mean when, if you ask to join the Triratna Buddhist order, which is the order and the movement that we're part of, what you do is that you start to go on ordination training retreats. And there's 2 weeks on retreats basically, and every single day on this 2-week retreat, you just do a really, really strong spiritual workshop. A little bit like the study sessions that Satyadasa has been leading, but in a way much more challenging. A lot of the material on these ordination training retreats is about directly challenging unhelpful and wrong and unwise views. So I spent about 6 years going on these training retreats. And I was thinking that, I feel like I really learned 2 things on my training retreat. I feel slightly embarrassed to say this because probably everyone's thinking like, only 2? But I feel like I learned them very well. So the 2 things that I learned on these training retreats, number 1 was you can't have it all. Yeah, I can't have it all. I just remember being really shocked when I heard that. Like, what do you mean I can't have it all? It was as if like I had just grown up reading too many fashion magazines, and I just thought like life was British Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, and those like women's magazines that sort of tell you that you can have it all, but actually you can't. You can't. Life is not like that. Yeah. So that was the first thing, and then the second view that I kind of really uncovered was that the 3 words that I really wanted to hear, like really, 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 really wanted to hear, wasn't "I love you." It was "you are right." And I think, probably other people are like this. You may or may not want to admit it to yourself, but all of us, I'm sorry it's like slightly looking at Ipoli, I don't know why, but all of us want to know that we are right. Yeah. Actually, I just want Ipoli to tell me that my spreadsheets are better than his spreadsheets, which is another way of saying I'm right. Oh. Yeah. Anyway, so maybe you might think about your own views and the views that hold you back, and sort of how they manifest, in the world, or how you manifest those views in the world, and the sort of suffering that arises independent on clinging to those views. Anyway, so back to the story. So Mara's sons and Mara's daughters have been defeated, and Mara's dejected. He's actually really, really dejected. He's really upset by this point. But he's also very, very proud. Mara's a very proud figure, and he will not back down from the battle with the Buddha-to-be. So Mara decides to play his final card. He appears before Siddhartha, Mara Papian, the evil one, Nimuchi, the demon. He says, "Who are you to sit there? What right do you have? You should just do your duty as a prince and become a king. Your virtue lies in exactly doing your duty, which is to become a king. On what grounds could you ever achieve liberation?" And the Buddha responds very, very simply, very beautifully. He envelops Mara, his whole retinue, his army, his sons, his daughters, with metta. And without fear, he gracefully taps his right hand on the ground and he says, "I have practiced kindness and generosity and patience and compassion for all beings for incalculable lifetimes. This earth supports all beings. She is impartial and she is unbiased, and she is my witness that I speak no lies." And then in that instance, the earth goddess manifested, half rising out of the earth, and she says in this beautiful, melodious voice, "It is just as he says. We bear witness to his life." And then, I love this detail, she rebukes Mara. She basically tells Mara off and sings the praises of Siddhartha and then disappears. So Mara accepts defeat, and some of the stories, his whole retinue disappears, his armies disappear, his sons and daughters disappear, and Mara just shrinks into a tiny little wretched figure, sitting cross-legged with his shoulders drooping, downcast, dismayed, brooding, unable to say anything, and scratching the ground with a stick. And then Mara soon departs, and the Buddha is alone at last. So it was a full moon that evening, just like this morning was a full moon. Today is a full moon day. And under this very, very same moon that we sit under, Siddhartha sat, and his concentration deepened to the very, very limits of perception, letting go in the most basic way in which his experience formed itself, and seeing into the impermanent and conditioned nature of even the subtlest movement of his mind, completely undisturbed by any ripple of craving and of aversion, and attained to the most profound equanimity. And as dawn broke and the realization of nirvana was at hand, Siddhartha emerged from his meditation a fundamentally different person, a fundamentally different being, a different class of being in a way. And the being that arose under that arose from that meditation seat under the Bodhi tree was no longer Siddhartha. He was the Buddha. So rising from his seat, he spends the next 7 weeks seated under different trees by the Naranjara River, meditating, absorbing his experience. And the tales tell how he sat for these 7 weeks under 7 different trees, 7 being like kind of magical number, and how at one point there was this tremendous rainstorm. And Mukhalinda, the king of the Nagas are sort of like mythical serpent type beings, the king of the Nagas rose up during the storm and wrapped itself around the Buddha, put its hood over the head of the Buddha and sheltered the Buddha from the rain, sheltered the Buddha from the storm. And the stories also tell us about how the Buddha wondered whether there was anyone in the world who could comprehend his experience, which was so subtle, so hard to see, so hard to understand. And he says in the Arya Pariyesana Sutta, if I were to teach the Dharma and others would not understand me, it would be wearying and troublesome to me. And considering thus, he actually inclined not to teach the Dharma. But then what happened was, out of compassion, he surveyed the world, and there arose in his mind a vision of humanity. And just like there were all kinds of lotuses in the pond, all in different stages of development, different shapes, different qualities. Some were buds, some were fully open flowers, some were like half opened, some were really, really tight, and some were just much more sort of, relaxed, beautiful. Just so, all of humanity is like that. There were beings in different myriad states of development and receptivity and qualities, and that there were beings that might be able to understand. So he did decide to teach. And first of all, he thought about his 2 teachers. He thought about the 2 teachers who taught him when he first went on the quest. He thought about Alara Kalama and Udraka Ramaputra, and he realized that they were both dead. And then he thought a little bit more, and he thought about his 5 friends, the ones who abandoned him when he gave up asceticism. So he set off from Gaya in a walk to Varanasi to find them. And thus began the ministry of the Buddha. He taught the 5 ascetics, then he taught Yasa and his 60 friends, then he taught Kashyapa and the other matted hair ascetics that were Kashyapa's followers. And then when there was a good cohort of enlightened beings, he exhorted them and told them to wander and to teach for the welfare of all beings. And the Buddha himself did that. He sort of crisscrossed northern India, actually went quite far south, And he crisscrossed India for the rest of his life, walking and talking to people, and he just taught everybody. He taught kings, he even went back to his father, he taught his relatives, he taught very, very normal people, farmers, merchants, he taught courtesans, he taught people regardless of their creed and regardless of their caste. Yeah. So I've been actually really thinking about this, that maybe most fairy tales would actually have stopped at the dawning of the morning after the battle with Mara. Yeah. So in the Disney version, I think what it would be is that nirvana would be the kind of like happily ever after that the Buddha existed post his enlightenment experience. And then I thought, well, it's probably not just Disney, because we too need to be careful about how it is that we conceive the goal of spiritual life. We might individually have a lot of faith and a lot of energy and really be going for it, really be aiming all our energy and like the whole of us towards the state of nirvana, towards the state of enlightenment. But underneath it all, we kind of sort of conceptualize nirvana as like a spiritual retirement home, with beige walls and beige food and not very much of it. And I think sometimes enlightenment for me, and it's slightly embarrassing to admit this, is that I think I'll be sort of like me, but nicer. Like fundamentally me, but without like the fun and the passion and all the quirky bits that make up my personality. So me, but good and boring, which isn't really that inspiring or energizing. So rather than thinking that nirvana is a noun, a place that you can go, or a place that I can go, it is actually much, much closer and much more grammatically correct to think of nirvana as a verb, yeah? So nirvana is something that we do, and nirvana is how we fundamentally relate to experience, and the freedom and the clarity that comes from a deep, deep relaxation and relinquishment even of all our views. One of the ways I sort of think about wisdom in my life, or notice sort of like little inklings of wisdom in my life, is to have a sense of a very, very broad perspective. I think of wisdom as having the broadest possible perspective of the world. And when we allow ourselves to be tied up in our assumptions about how the world is or how it should be, when we allow ourselves to be tied up in prejudices, we close down and we narrow that perspective that we have on the world. But when I'm able to relax, not to get drawn into ideas about how the world should be like this, or they are like that, or they are doing this because of this, and I'm like that, if I'm not drawn into those stories, drawn in by those views, sort of seduced or clinging to those views, I feel like there's real relief, it's real relief and relaxation, and there's energy release. I feel energized, and then there's a sense of freedom. So just as we tie ourselves up in knots, and with our reactions and our fears and our clingings, and samsara and suffering is what we do. I think nirvana is also what we do. I just want to end on this thing about energy release, because I think energy release, the energy release that is released from stopping being tied up in the project of the self, is actually released for the good of all beings. And that's why the story of the Buddha doesn't end with his awakening. It goes on to his teaching career. Career is probably like the wrong word, but it goes on to the story of like how he then helped people, after his enlightenment experience. He goes on to teach for the benefit of all beings. Okay. So I think that's all I want to say.